Okay. Good morning, everyone. Very nice to be here. Nice to meet you all. And thank you for the very warm welcome. I don't know how many introductions we had, there were quite a few introductions. It was actually very topical because turbulent times. I came from Poland yesterday, flew between Warsaw and Brussels, and the plane was really turbulent all the way across. So I really felt the turbulence of the world that's coming here. So it's kind of extraordinary that we are in the external action part of the EU. Yeah, if anyone should be concerned or affected by the turbulent world, surely it must be you. Are you all from the external? I know some of you are from the Thai embassy, but the rest of you are from the external action. Yeah, so because this whole building is that, right? Everyone here is that. Okay, so that kind of makes it easy. So it's incredibly kind of topical. It's kind of extraordinary. Just the last few days after this talk was decided, things seem to be escalating even more around the world. So it's kind of very good timing, so to speak, or bad timing, depending on how you look at it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the Buddhist ideas around peace and around how to reflect on the world in a way that actually leads to something positive rather than something negative. Because there's so much to do with perception, so much to do with our attitude, so much to do with our intention, how we think about things, and that then tends to lead on to some positive outcome one way or the other. And that is kind of remarkable. Yeah, you would think that something like war is inherently bad, it must be terrible and whatever, but even that can be looked at in a certain way so that actually it has, in the long run at the very least, a positive outcome, some kind of positive result as a consequence. That is kind of the Buddhist attitude, yeah? Make something positive out of the negative. And if you do that, of course, then these negative things become, in a sense, they become causes for even the enhancement of your life, because you start to seek value in slightly different places, which is part of what this is about. So I'm going to start to talk a little bit about some very basic insights into how to think about things. And I remember one of the very interesting things I saw just as the Ukraine war was starting. There were still lots of journalists in Ukraine. I think there probably still are now. I don't know exactly how that works. And I remember they were, interviewing ordinary people on the street, asking them, how does this affect your life? The idea of, the Russians kind of coming in and all of this. And the results of those interviews were very interesting, because there were like two ways of responding to the invasion by the Russians. And one way was like, oh no, this is terrible, everything is getting destroyed, some of my friends have died already in this thing, and what is my future? There is no future anymore, my future has been destroyed, I'm just going to have to leave and come to, I don't know, Poland, lots of Ukrainians in Poland, maybe Belgium. Have you got many Ukrainians in Belgium as well? Yeah, okay, good. Lots of them in Norway, lots of them everywhere, it seems. And so that was one way of thinking about it. But there was another way. And there were people who said, I don't even dare to say this. They said, I'm not afraid, I'm not sure if I should be saying this, but I actually feel happier after the invasion of the Russians. That was kind of remarkable. Because it's so counterintuitive. It makes you wonder what is going on here. And what they were saying was that, once the Russians invaded our country, we felt a kind of renewed sense of purpose. We felt a sense of compassion for our fellow Ukrainians. We felt a sense of coming together, acting together, supporting each other in the community. And that sense of coming together was more important for people's well-being than the negative impact of the invasion itself. That's kind of extraordinary when we think about it. There was two different attitudes in the population. Some people dealt with it well, and some people dealt with it badly. And so one of the very interesting questions then is, well, who is it that dealt with it well? What can we learn from that? Can we draw some lessons from this to understand how we can also maybe think about the world in such a way that we can react more like the second person rather than the first person? So this is one of the, to me, it's kind of an insight into the world. The world looks very often to be in a certain way. It looks to be bad, but the reality on the ground, when you are there in the middle of the conflict, often looks different from what you would expect. You expect it to be terrible, but actually it turns out it's actually divided. It depends on certain other qualities, whether it's really bad or not. And that reminded me of another thing, which I remember I read a long time ago, before I was a monk. This was when I still had a girlfriend. This is like 40 years ago or something. I can barely remember. It's kind of in the mist of history somewhere far back in my mind. And this was a very nice girlfriend. She got me this book called something about human beings and happiness or something like that. It was written by this Norwegian guy who had gone through the Second World War. And then he wrote this book about his experiences during the Second World War. And what he said, that was very interesting, was that very similar to what this lady in Ukraine was saying. Many of us felt more happy during the war than before the war. He wasn't afraid of saying it because he was like, he was writing his book, but this lady in Ukraine, she was almost, I can't say this because it kind of goes against the stream. But he was saying this. He was observing what happened to him as a person during the war contra what was before the war. And he said many of the same things that this lady in Ukraine said. He said that when the Germans invaded Norway, I should say that Norway was not very much affected at all by the Second World War compared to most of continental Europe, like Belgium or Poland. Poland was very, very devastated during the Second World War. But still, there is hardship. Because still there were lots of people killed. There were people sent off to the concentration camp in Auschwitz, etc. But he said that during that war, when the Germans invaded, we came together. We started to have more compassion for others. Whereas before the war, we always argued with each other. We couldn't agree on anything. They probably argued about politics in those days as well, just like they do now. Nothing has really changed. Nothing really changes, Things are always the same. We think that kind of things change, but I don't really believe that. So anyway, we'll come back to that later on. So, we came together. We had compassion and understanding. We worked hard together. There's a fellow of brothership and sisterhood in this way. And that happiness that came out of that kind of spiritual turning of the mind towards deeper values, that happiness was more important than the negative impact of the Germans entering the country. So there is problem, but there's also happiness coming out of this. And sometimes the happiness is greater. So what is it about these qualities that people developed when someone invaded their country? And what you will recognize that many of these countries are what we call spiritual qualities, or religious qualities. Qualities like compassion, qualities like harmony, working together, qualities like goodwill towards your fellow human beings. These are really spiritual qualities. These are the opposite of what we very often see in the world, which is selfishness, aggression, and these kind of things, or whatever it might be in the world. And so because before the Second World War, people were, of course, more interested in the material things of life. That's kind of what the world is like usually when there isn't a big problem. Then, when the war comes, you have to let go of those material sides to your life a little bit because they are no longer available. Things are rationed. Things were rationed during the Second World War. It was difficult to get food. It was difficult to get clothes. Everything was very hard. And so your focus changes from the material things of the world towards the spiritual things of the world instead. And that is what happened then. That is what happened to this lady in Ukraine. There's a movement from the material to the spiritual. And that tells us how important spiritual qualities are. We don't need to use the word religious. Many people are not religious these days. But spiritual still has a certain meaning. It means the inner qualities of a human being, the mind, the development of the mind. That is more important for our well-being than the external circumstances. And this is an incredibly powerful insight. It says something about what we should really focus on in our lives, what really matters. And to even think about this in even broader context, one of the things that I like to say to people is that your future does not depend so much on what happens in the world. Your future depends more on your inner qualities. So this is again coming back to what happened in Norway and happened to this lady in Ukraine. If you develop those inner spiritual qualities, then you have a certain resilience, a certain power within you, that when the war comes, you react in that positive way in which they did. Yeah, so your future is not so dependent on whether there's a war in Ukraine or a war in the Middle East or a war anywhere really. Your future much more depends on your ability, developing the spiritual qualities and gives you the resilience and the power to cope with those difficult situations when they arise. Because they will arise. Yeah, this is part of the problem. They will always arise, these things. They always come back to the world. They're always there. And that is part of the issue here. One of the kind of very interesting things about history and the way we deal with the world, that when things go very well, like in the decades after the Second World War, when things were kind of going very well, at least in Europe, yeah, we had the Second World War, we were really fed up with fighting and all of these kind of things. And so things were very smooth. And then what happens when things are quite smooth and everyone is cooperating reasonably well? That's why we have the European Union now, is because of the Second World War and all the problems. Yeah, when things go well, we often become complacent. We become stupid. We become too interested in material things. And we start arguing with each other. We can't really work together. We forget about harmony. We forget about the importance of functioning societies. And then eventually, because we forget about those things, we kind of come back to war again. We become stupid. And then when the war comes, suddenly we realize the importance of those qualities. It's almost like we need the hardship, the wars, the problems, the famines, the refugee crisis. We need those things to remind us of the importance of the spiritual qualities. And this is what I mean, that sometimes these very difficult situations can be a blessing in disguise. Yeah, you are now all here, and I don't know whether you will get anything out of this talk, but hopefully you do, and if you do, it's a blessing in disguise, because we are here, in part, because of the problems in the world. So if we look again, one more time, at the problems of the world in the right way, yeah, it becomes a blessing for us, because it changes our attitude. We move from those material ideas about what is important in life towards the spiritual qualities instead. And this then becomes a blessing in our life that extends far beyond the ability to cope with crises and problems and wars, etc. It extends into our whole life. Because if you live with spiritual qualities, it will affect your family life. It will affect how you treat your spouse, how you treat your children, how you treat your parents. It will affect how you deal, how things go at work. Yeah, if you treat your fellow workers well, you have a good work life. Yeah, if you treat them well, if you treat them with kind of sense of competition and whatever, then it becomes very difficult to work together. And so it extends into your whole life. And in this way, if we use these crises wisely, like these other people did, if we do that, then suddenly our life changes and we're moving in a different direction. We are less complacent, we are less stupid, less silly about how we live our lives. So it has real long-term consequences for us. Yeah, if you live according to spiritual values, it changes how your life is. Your future again is determined by your inner qualities, not so much by the external world. And in Buddhism, we have an idea of rebirth. Yeah, I don't know if any one of you has any idea of rebirth. In Christianity, you have a bit of rebirth. Yeah, you go to heaven as a kind of rebirth, maybe. But we have an idea of rebirth. And of course, that rebirth is definitely, conditioned by your spiritual qualities. Very, very important part of that. So your long-term future, in that sense, is even more determined by the qualities within. So both in this life, and if you do happen to believe in future lives as well. So this is point number one that I want to make. Yeah, the idea of really appreciating the importance and the power of the inner qualities of a human being. Good qualities in human beings, in ourselves, are incredibly important to kind of make the world work for us, and then we can change things. But then I would like to move on a little bit more closely to what the Buddha is talking about. These are, of course, Buddhist values, but they are a little bit on, the broader context, if you like. I'm going to talk a little bit more about how the Buddha reflects on this, and to give you an idea of how to take this sense of refuge from the world in a deeper direction, more than just kind of ordinary spiritual qualities, but take it into meditation and these kind of things as well. And there's a very nice story. This is a story from what we call the early Buddhist text, also known as the sutras. These are like the discourses, the talks that the Buddha gave. And there is a very important discourse, which is about the last days of the Buddha. Yeah, the Buddha knows that he's coming towards the end of his life. He knows that he's going to pass away. He says, in 3 months from now, I'm going to pass away. He can see, I think we all know this to some extent when we come to the end of our life. And then a monk called Ananda. Ananda is the Buddha's attendant, has been the Buddha's attendant for a long time, 20 years or something. He sees the Buddha is sick. Yeah, the Buddha was a human being, he had a human body, he gets sick like everyone else, and he's not a god, that's a very important point. And so he sees the Buddha getting sick. And then when he sees the Buddha getting sick, he sees that my sense of directions, I lost my sense of direction, I forgot the teachings, and I was confused. Yeah, this is what you can imagine this happening if you are the Buddha's attendant. You are with what arguably is the great, is one of the greatest spiritual geniuses in human history. As a Buddhist, I would go further, but anyway, that's kind of a more neutral way of putting it. Yeah, and so one of the greatest spiritual geniuses in human history, who has been the focus of attention for a large Buddhist community for 45 years. Every little problem in the Buddhist community, and they will go to the Buddha. Yeah, sometimes you feel sorry for the Buddha. Imagine every small problem. Yeah, how long can I grow my hair? Yeah, and the Buddha says, okay, only kind of not too long. Yeah, this is okay. Ajahn Brahmali, you're doing well. Yeah, this is within the limits. You can imagine after a while the Buddha probably gets really fed up. He has thousands of questions coming in all the time. So probably the Buddha is probably reasonably happy to pass away. He has probably had enough of his life at that particular point. I don't know. I'm just kind of saying it. But Ananda, yeah, who the community around him, especially his main attendant, they are really confused. How are we going to live? This is a momentous time in the history of Buddhism when the Buddha is about to pass away. Maybe one of the most, apart from the awakening of the Buddha, as we talk about as Buddhists, his passing away is very momentous. And everyone is up in arms. What are we going to do now? How are we going to carry on? Who is going to be our teacher after this? Are we lost? Yeah? What's going to happen? And so people are crying and wailing and they don't know what to do with themselves. And then the Buddha, he says to Venerable Ananda, he says to him, but haven't I told you that everything that is dear and pleasing to you in this world must become otherwise, must become separated from you? It's a very powerful saying. Everything in your life that is dear and pleasing to you must become otherwise, must become separated from you. It's like in your face, right? But it is true. We know that all the things we have in this life, often they disappear while we have them. Sometimes you have someone who steals something from you, your relationship breaks up. There's always kind of these things always happen throughout our life. But we certainly know that at the moment when we die, absolutely everything is going to have to go. There's nothing that you can hold on to. And so he's basically saying to Anand, I've been telling you all of these things. Everything must become separated from you. So why grieve? This is the nature of things. This is the way the world is. And then he says to Anand, he says that instead of taking the world as your refuge, and this is what people do. Yeah, we take the world as our refuge. That's why we become so distressed when we have wars in Ukraine, which isn't that far away from Belgium, even closer to Poland, where I just came from. That's why we become so distressed, because we feel that the refuge we have, the place of our safety, our homes, our families, everything is at stake. And that is very, very upsetting. And so the Buddha says, instead of taking the world as your refuge, you should take yourself as a refuge. You should take the teachings as your refuge. And then he explains to Venerable Ananda what this means. And what this means, he says, just to make it simple, because you are not super well versed probably in Buddhist teachings, to make it reasonably simple, what that means is doing proper meditation practice. Why? Because when you do proper meditation practice, you are going inwards instead of going outwards. And in that inner life, where you become peaceful, where you find joy, where you find a sense of safety, where you find a sense of freedom, not the least, all of these things arise through that inner cultivation of the mind. That is where you find that freedom from the world, moving away from the world, no longer relying on the world in the same way. So this is like really interesting, right? If you have a place within yourself. Because it isn't affected by the world outside, you have a place where you can always find a refuge, always a place of safety, always a place where the world is no longer so important to you. And that is the purpose of meditation practice in the long run. And the deeper you take that meditation, the more powerful that refuge becomes, the refuge from the world. It's like your own little bunker, yeah? You go inside, nothing can hit you. You are safe and sound within your little bunker within her. That is the idea here. And so you build this up as far as you can. So this idea of things that the world is impermanent, is a very important idea in Buddhism. Because the idea that things are impermanent, always changeable, always unreliable, and always moving on, is a fundamental aspect of the way the world is. It's called anicca in the Buddhist teachings. The moving on of things, always changing. And this is, in a sense, just to bring out some. Are you okay? Yeah. But this is a kind of fundamental aspect of the Buddhist teachings and of the worldview of the Buddhists, which is quite different from the way that the worldview of most other societies. And this is the worldview that things are always moving, always changing. There's no inherent essence in the way the world is. Things are always moving on. And what that means, again, is this idea that there is nothing stable anywhere that you can really hold on to. Things are always changing here. And this is a very interesting kind of worldview, and it's very different in the Buddhist teaching compared to the Christianity or any Western religion or our contemporary society or even scientific outlook. Because it's this idea, time in a sense, is measured in a different way in the Dhamma, in the Buddhist teaching, compared to how it's measured in our ordinary societies. The Western culture, you have the idea of Christianity, God creates the world, and then kind of the world kind of moves in a certain way, and then you come eventually to like the second coming of Christ or something like that. That's kind of the idea of Christianity. I'm not sure if you believe in that, any of you here, but that's kind of the bedrock, the foundation of how we view the world in Western societies. And because we have this idea of kind of progress, the world that's created, it has a certain endpoint, it is to be expected. It's a linear idea of time. It begins in a certain place, ends in a certain place. And so our societies are like based on a similar idea that we are moving forward. We're going in a certain direction, heading towards a better state in the world, better governance, better dealing with social problems, always moving in the right direction. And of course, you can be forgiven to believe that that is true. There are certain aspects of humanity that over the last few centuries or millennia have been going in a very positive direction. Our understanding of nature, our ability to control nature, our development of technology, our overcoming of diseases, and all of these kind of things, it has been going in the right way. So we can be forgiven for believing that. And if you look at some of the great intellectuals in Western society, one of the ones who writes about this is someone like Steven Pinker, professor at Harvard University, and he talks about how kind of war has gone down and how we're kind of heading in a better direction on many indicators. And so we have this feeling that we're going somewhere, moving in a certain direction. And this means that we have a certain we look at the world in a certain way. Wars should not really happen, because we're going in the right way. We're supposed to overcome wars once and for all. Second World War is the last war, because now we have finally understood the perils and the disasters of kind of fighting each other, killing 18 million people or whatever it is that died during the Second World War. But from a Buddhist point of view, this is a mistaken way of looking at the world. The world time is not linear. It doesn't have a starting point. Science is almost a bit like that as well. Science talks about the Big Bang as a starting point of the universe, and then kind of the big kind of, what is it called, when the kind of everything cools down and goes into nothing at the other end. That's kind of a modern view of science. I'm not sure if scientists really believe that it started at the Big Bang, but that's kind of the worldview we are growing up with. But Buddhism is not like that. In Buddhism, time is cyclical. It goes in circles. We always come back again. So the fact that the world has been going well for maybe a few hundred years or a few thousand years, that's just a blip in the larger picture of things. The larger picture is far more vast. And the vastness of Buddhist ideas is that, that the universe comes back again. And so instead of having a universe that begins with a big bang and ends with a big whimper, whatever it is that they call it, the big whimper of the universe, is that the universe comes back again, it starts all over. And it goes through these enormous cycles, of kind of expansion and contraction, again and again, round and round, on and on. And in that larger view of the world, human beings get reborn. You re-arise. You follow along with the universe, from one universe to the next one. That's another of these cyclical events, the idea of rebirth and carrying on. In this universe, there is no real endpoint. It's just more of the same. And wars will always return. These things will always come back. Yes, it may go better for a while. Yes, we create some good governance for a while. But there is no final solution. There is no endpoint where you create a utopian society whereby everything is going to be well forever after. And that is the Buddhist idea. And because that is the Buddhist idea, it has certain consequences for how you think about your life. It means that instead of trying your very best to create a better world, and sometimes I think that some of the wars that we are seeing now, whether it is in the Middle East or the Russian war, it comes from that kind of worldview. The war itself is started because of that. I don't know the details about this, but I get the feeling that people like Vladimir Putin has some idea of, we're going to create a greater Russia, and has some kind of idea of the destiny of the Russian nation to become great or something like that. Some kind of underlying ideological things that lie there. And then you have the Israelis in Palestine and Israel who believe in the idea of the God-given right. This is our Israel, and we have a God-given right to all of this territory. Again, there's this idea of some kind of linear purpose given by God moving in a certain direction. But actually, that is a false narrative from a Buddhist point of view. There is no destiny here. There is no kind of greater purpose. There isn't any one people who has been given a special right to anything. It's that things just go in cycles. You come back again, back to the same thing, back to the same problems. And when you start to realize that, when you understand that this is the nature of the world, again, the only thing to do that is rational, that really works well, is to go within. Build up those spiritual qualities. And as you build up those spiritual qualities within, then the cyclical return of the universe is no longer so. It doesn't affect you anymore in the same way. And you find the solution inside, rather than trying to find a utopian solution outside, which actually there is no such thing as a utopia from a Buddhist point of view. And so again, it shows you what we have to do as human beings, to actually create a better world. It starts with us. It starts with our individual actions. We create a better world for ourselves as individual beings. And as we do that, we touch other people and other beings in the world. It starts with individuals. It doesn't start with creating the perfect society. That is not the way it works. And so that brings us back to meditation practice again. How to use meditation to do this. So meditation is a very simple thing. Meditation is about sitting down. It's about allowing the mind to become peaceful. And very often we use little techniques to help the mind to become peaceful, like watching the breath or doing sending goodwill to the world. We have a Pali word called metta. Metta means like love or goodwill or friendliness or something like that. And so you sit down and you spread goodwill to the world. It's a very famous kind of Buddhist meditation. Metta bhavana is the word for that. Or you watch the breath, and if you're able to watch the breath in the right way, then again you can become very, very, very peaceful simply by watching the breath. That's all it really takes. It's surprising how powerful it can be, but it's also surprising how difficult it can be. You will find out, I think we're going to try it later on, do a little bit of breath meditation, and you may find that your mind goes all over the world. It goes to Gaza, it goes to Ukraine. I mean, you're all in the external action, so probably goes everywhere around the world, and now I came back to Brussels again for a short while, then you're off again somewhere else. That's very often what happens. But by giving priority to the spiritual values, you start to enable this meditation to happen. Suddenly it starts to come together because you know this is what you have to do. And the more deeply you know that this is important, this is what matters, the more it enables that meditation to actually work properly. And this is kind of the idea here. So we're going to try this in a second. But I would like to Okay, bye. So, but I would like also to extend the idea of finding a refuge in life, beyond the idea of meditation. We're going to have, as I said, let's do that in a second, but beyond meditation. And some of the very important things on the Buddhist path that enable meditation is the idea of virtue or kindness or morality. Very, very fundamental on the Buddhist path. There's two things that are fundamental. Looking at the world in the right way, knowing what to prioritize, this is called right view in Buddhism, or the idea of virtue and morality. So again, like I mentioned before, during the Second World War, this feeling of compassion and harmony and working together was a very, very powerful thing that made people, happy or resilient or able to work at that time. And so we want to do that now. Now is the time to kind of live in the right way, live with kindness, live with compassion, live with understanding. This is now is the time, and if you do this now, not only are you building up a resilience that will then lead to the resilience during the war, but it will also lead to the sort of mental qualities that supports the meditation practice. So all of these things start to come together. It's not just about meditation, that's what I'm saying. It's about living a more spiritual life with a spiritual outlook throughout your life. And this is really, really important. So you bring the idea of goodwill, you bring the idea of compassion into your daily life, with your colleagues, with your friends, with your family, with anyone in your community. And how can you do that? Because it can be very hard, very challenging to live with kindness, especially when you see what is going on in the world. How can you be kind to these aggressors? The people like kind of going into someone else's country. How can we have a degree of understanding, a larger understanding of the world that makes us not get angry, or upset with what is happening? How can we forgive basically everyone in the world? That becomes one of the foundational questions. If you can forgive everyone, then you can also be kind to everyone around the world. That's kind of the idea here. And one of the kind of fundamental Buddhist ideas is that as human beings, we are conditioned. Not only are we conditioned, we are very, very heavily conditioned. The person that you are now is the sum total of all the things that have worked on your life in the past. You will have been affected or conditioned by your parents, obviously, by your schooling, by your work here, in this building, probably in Brussels, wherever you have come from. And all of these things have conditioned us and made us who we are. The Buddhist idea is even broader than that. The conditioning does not stop in this life. It also goes back to past lives, You can imagine how that kind of changes your idea about how the world works when you have to take into account the conditioning even of past lives. But from that point of view, all we are these conditioned blobs, little blobs of meat walking around in the world. That's what we are, conditioned by the past, trying to do our best. And once you understand that, you cannot really blame anyone for who they are. You cannot blame anyone for their actions, because they have been conditioned to be that particular way. And we know that this is true to a very large extent, You know that sometimes when you get angry and upset with someone, it is because of certain conditioning. I'm just about to go back to I'm leaving this afternoon for Norway to visit my mother. She's still living over in Norway. And I know that when I see her, some of the old conditioning is going to kick in, She's going to say things to me. I say, what, you can't say that? I'm grown up now. I'm no longer your little boy, So things have changed in those kind of all those years. But the conditioning is so strong, it's very hard to let go of some of these things. And so we are these conditioned beings going around in the world, and we react to the world according to our background, according to our habits, according to all of these things. And there's very little often that we can do about that. Yes, we can take in new impulses. We can take in the impulses of kindness, of good spiritual teachings, and try to change our life. But at any particular point in time, we are basically very, very conditioned. And so once you start to see that, it starts to become possible to forgive people, because you understand that actually, very often, they haven't got much choice. So for example, take the Russian people who invaded Ukraine. Take the ordinary soldiers on the ground, often young men, maybe in the early 20s or whatever, who have been drafted into the army, and maybe they had no choice, maybe they just kind of were forced to do it, or maybe they did it to have a living. Everyone needs a living, we have to make money somehow. And then suddenly there is a war, and they get told to go into a foreign country and shoot people. How much agency can we give to those young men? How much responsibility do they have for what is going on? And how much just sheer conditioning? And they are forced to do something that probably deep down the majority of them don't want to do. They still have to do it, even if they don't want to do it. It is my firm belief that almost everyone in the world, everyone wants to be kind, because deep down we know that kindness is good for ourselves and good for the world around us. And when we are forced to do things against our own better interest that we know is actually wrong, then it's more like a tragedy than it is something bad happening in that person. And so you start to see this, and you start to look kind of at the army, and you look at, well, what about the generals in the army? Well, they too have been conditioned. They may be grown up and started off as a soldier, and now they suddenly find themselves in the position of general, and suddenly they're told to go to war. Well, they too are, in a sense, trapped by the larger system. And ultimately, you have someone like Vladimir Putin, who many people might say bears the final responsibility. But then you start to realize that he too, in many ways, is a function of Russian history, is a function of the propaganda of the system, is a function of certain ideologies, certain ideas that have somehow entered his brain, like a virus or whatever you want to call it. And then he acts according to that ideology, according to those ways. And that is the conditioning that drives a person like that on. And so it is kind of tragic, because that conditioning leads to the death of many, many other people. But ultimately, you can argue that he doesn't really understand what he's doing. No one in the world who kills another human being understands what they are doing. They are blinded in a very, very profound sense of the word. And so once you start to think about the world in this way, there is no one you cannot forgive. And when there is no one you cannot forgive in the whole world, you can start to act with a sense of kindness, of compassion, of goodwill, almost anywhere, in almost all circumstances. You can turn on the news at night. I agree with you, don't turn on the news, it's a very bad idea, I fully agree with that, but you can. And when you see the news through this new prism, through this new filter, you can see it as a large tragedy unfolding, rather than blaming people within that theater of war that is going on out there. That already is very helpful right there. So in this way, we can turn around, reflect on the world in a new way, instead of blaming, understanding that we are all ultimately both perpetrators and victims in this great play of the world in various kind of ways. And sometimes the roles change. Sometimes we are the perpetrator, someone else is the victim. And especially if you have this Buddhist idea of many lives, you can imagine how we cycle around, and how all of us take on these different roles. And once you do that, once you see yourself as taking on all of these different roles, how can you get so angry with these people? Because now you're suddenly standing in their shoes. Suddenly you too have maybe done some of these things in the past. And then you start to understand the conditioning that is going on. So if you want to forgive, and you also want to forgive yourself and forgive everyone, then this is the right way to, or at least one way of understanding the world and allowing that forgiveness to happen. When you can have that kind of level of forgiveness and moral clarity in your life, then you become a very gentle and soft and kind person. You don't really become angry so easily anymore. When you don't have that sense of anger and ill will in your life, your mind is naturally more peaceful. When the mind is much more peaceful, you sit down, close your eyes, you watch your breath, and you get a much deeper peace as a consequence. And then this whole spiritual practice, the whole idea of finding peace within, starts to really have a lot of power and a lot of effect in your life. This is how you build up the power of peace within, in a very turbulent and difficult world. So, that is just a little bit of an introduction to what we are going to do, which really matters, which is the meditation practice. So let us move on to the part that actually is important. Well, that's exactly 45 minutes, amazing. So that's kind of handy. So let us Let us do a few minutes of meditation, maybe 15 minutes or so, not too long, just to give you a taste of what is going on. And, all right. So when you do your meditation practice, it is important to start out by feeling comfortable. So it's a good idea to close your eyes. When you close your eyes, you can feel your body much more clearly, and you can feel the body. Make sure that you don't have any pains. You're comfortable in the body. Lean gently back in the seat. Put your feet kind of plainly on the ground, so they kind of you sit in a stable posture. You don't have to move very much. And then you gradually find the ease of the body. And one of the nice things about focusing on the body is that you can often feel the tension in the mind through the body. If the body has a bit of tension, if the body is not relaxed, you know this originates in the mind. And so by allowing the body to relax, by focusing on the body, taking some deep breaths, and just being patient with yourself, both the body and the mind become more peaceful. And at the beginning of meditation, it is important just to allow things to settle down. Often you come into the meditation with memories and perceptions and news in your mind. Allow all of that to fade away. Now is a time of peace. This time is the most important time of your life when you recalibrate yourself, make yourself ready to deal with the challenges of life. So make this time important. If you prioritize this time, if you make it important, it becomes possible to be peaceful, letting go of the world outside. The idea here is to be a passive observer. You can imagine yourself as a passenger on a train, not the driver, but the passenger. And the passenger has to accept whatever they see through the window. You have no choice. So you're just observing through the window, seeing the thoughts arising in your mind, seeing the thoughts passing away, hearing the sound outside, allowing the sound to pass away. Just whatever impressions come into your mind, just observing passively. A passenger on the train. You are not in the driver's seats, you're passively aware. The idea here is to give rise to a degree of mindfulness, a degree of clarity of the mind. You feel reasonably peaceful, reasonably aware. If you don't, that's okay. If you keep on thinking, or you feel tired or whatever, don't push it out of the way. Allow it to be. And as you allow it to be, these issues that you have, they gradually fade away as well. So allow things to be. Silent awareness is the best way to allow the problems to fade away. And as you keep calming down gradually, there comes a point when the breath sort of comes into focus by itself. It's as if you are waiting for the breath to come. And then when the breath comes, just allow it to be there. Stay with the breath, but without force, without trying, without pulling it in. And if you can be at ease with the breath, as if you are observing something far away that you have no control over, like a mountain in the distance, or the wind in the trees. The breath should be like that. You have a distance to the breath, no holding on, no clinging on, just enjoying the smooth, peaceful feeling of the breath. And just allow the breath to come and go. Sometimes you lose it, it disappears. That is okay. Just wait for the breath to return. Don't hold on, don't cling on. Enjoy the breath. The more you enjoy it, the more powerful the meditation will be. Feel the sense of cool, silky quality, the evenness of the incoming and the outgoing breath. Like a beautiful rhythm. Enjoy that. And as you enjoy that, as you see the peace in that, it grows by itself, becoming more and more peaceful. what a delightful thing it is to sit down quietly like this and allow everything to fade away with a group of people, good people, trying to do the right thing in the world. What a wonderful thing it is to do these sort of things together. As we come to an end of this short meditation, just wish the whole world well. The world needs well-wishing. The world needs a sense of compassion. So from your heart, let the whole world know. May everyone, all beings, all humans, everyone in this world, may you be well, may you be happy. And now ask yourself, how do you feel? And if you do feel a bit more peaceful, at ease, relaxed, and if you have a bit more goodwill, ask yourself why that is the case. Okay, so that is the end of meditation, so please come out. Okay, so that's a little taste for you, tiny, minute taste. It's good as a starting point. You've got to start somewhere, that is one of those starting points. So I would like to open up the possibility for us to have a bit of questions or discussion or whatever. This is the press room after all, so we're going to have questions. So you're very welcome to ask anything you like. Nothing is really off limits as far as I'm concerned. So we're very happy to take some questions from you. So I'm not sure how we organize this, but yeah. Yeah, he'll bring the microphone around. That's great. Yeah.
We've got an extra microphone here, so if you've got any questions, reflections of what we just heard, I think it's quite a powerful messages that we got here today. Helping us a lot in coping with our daily situations here. As you rightly said, we are exposed to this external turbulences quite a lot here in the European External Action Service. I myself found a few of your remarks quite useful. For me, I was adding myself to it, and that is still coming back. I'm coming back to the COVID times. When I had more time to reflect on what was going on, it was kind of a stop in the world's history. The importance of some routines in finding this peace in yourself and helping you to cope with difficult times. But I'm happy to give you also the possibility to ask the questions.
Over here, okay, right.
I would have two questions. One of them is directly more related to the work done at IAS, which is how Buddhism approaches artificial intelligence, in the sense that there's a lot of fear, for instance, of the connection between AI and the defense industry or the military field, but at the same time there is this fear that it could develop its own awareness, its own mindfulness to some extent. And then the second question is more related of how Buddhism approaches ego. Constantly we see ego.
Yeah.
We constantly see daily manifestations of ego.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say that I have a negative vision of ego, because sometimes it can be useful to put boundaries, to set limits, but it kind of contradicts awareness, mindfulness.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Well, two very big questions. Ego and AI. Maybe we can unify them somehow. I don't know. Anyways, starting with AI, I think the Buddhist view of AI is that it will not develop consciousness, because consciousness does not arise in that way, according to Buddhism. Consciousness in Buddhism, this kind of comes back to this idea I had before. Buddhism has an idea of rebirth, and so consciousness arises from one life to the next life through the process of rebirth. So you will have, somehow the AI would have to be part of this process of rebirth, which seems very unlikely. I'm not sure how that would be possible. So I would say, from a Buddhist point of view, we have the problem with the modern world and AI is that we have a very weak understanding of what consciousness of the mind is in the world. We don't really, it's called a hard problem of consciousness among philosophers. No one really knows what it is. And so when people ask, is AI going to become conscious? Actually, they're just kind of fumbling in the dark, because they have no theory of the mind. Because they have no theory of the mind, they have nowhere to no pegs to kind of hang these ideas on. And so from my point of view, because no one else has a theory, I say, well, I'm going to use the Buddhist theory of mind. Yeah, the Buddhist theory of mind is that mind arises through a process of rebirth. And because AI, I can't see how AI can be part of that. I said, there's no way AI can be conscious. That's part one of the question, and that's actually helpful, because conscious AI would be a nightmare. Right? Would be really, would be ethically kind of completely terrible thing if that happened. But the second point about AI is that I don't know anything about it. That's point number two. I have no idea about AI. So if you ask me, it's like asking, But what I can say, I can read what other people say about it. Some people say it's going to be the greatest benefit to humanity ever seen, and I think in some area that is probably true. Not in warfare, as you mentioned, of course, that's going to be very bad, but in other areas like medical science, maybe, or whatever. But on the other hand, there are people who say that these things are going to destroy humanity. Yeah? So it's kind of this thing again. What is actually going on? I don't know. I can't tell you. But what I can say comes back to this idea of what the Buddha is talking about the uncertainty of everything, how everything is so unreliable. We don't know the future. We don't know what's going to happen next. We don't know when the next war is going to happen. We don't know when the next big AI problem is going to happen. And so if you think about AI in the right way, to me, it brings you back to the importance of the spiritual values, because that is where your future is really created, not through AI, not through stopping war, but through the spiritual qualities. So when I see all the uncertainty with AI, it actually, to me, it just turns me off the world even more, because I just feel, okay, I don't know where this is going to end. This is so unreliable. So, in other words, my answer, I'm not sure how useful it is for you, but that's kind of how I think about AI. Ego is a very big problem. Yeah, really, really big problem. And you don't need an ego to set boundaries. You can be egoless and still ask for boundaries. You set boundaries because you know if something is painful, something is bad for you. So you still set boundaries, but you do it with kindness and compassion for yourself, not out of ego. There's two different things. And so ego is really, really problematic. I think a lot of the wars in the world are caused by ego. Meditation is destroyed by your ego. If you have a lot of ego, you will think about things, you will evaluate things, you will be concerned about yourself, all of these kind of things. It has a bad effect on meditation. Ego has a kind of universal, to my mind, bad consequence. However, having said that, it is not really conceivable for people not to have an ego. Yeah, people are going to have an ego. And so what we have to do, instead of saying we're going to go from ego to eliminating ego completely, which is not really possible in the world, it may be possible for certain individuals who practice a spiritual path very profoundly, but not for the majority of people. So what we have to do instead is create a good ego. Yeah, and that is what the practice of spiritual values is about, to create some kind of positive feeling within yourself, and you identify with those feelings. A classical example for me is the problems in Myanmar. Yeah, we had a while ago, a Buddhist country, but obviously treating the Rohingya refugees very badly. What is going on there? And what is going on there is that people identify as Buddhist. Buddhism becomes an extension of the ego. this is me. And because Buddhism is an extension of the ego, they feel threatened by the Rohingyas when they come in. And so you are personally threatened by the Rohingyas, and that's why you do bad things. That personal identity trumps your Buddhist values, whatever they might be. And so there's an identity problem. So instead of identifying as a Buddhist, we should identify as a practicing Buddhist. Then the whole thing is turned around, because now your identity is with your kindness. Then you will never treat the Rohingyas bad. And this is how you use the ego in a positive way to change the trajectory and how it works. And maybe ultimately you can also eliminate the ego entirely. So that was my answer to those two questions.
That's the questions.
Please also ask really simple questions,
I have a very simple question. My very, very simple question, and very practical, would be, how do you cope with the smartphone? Because I find it a very, very disturbing kind of tool. It's helpful, but also for this particular set of reflections that you gave us, it's has quite a potential to drive us out of this way. So, as you are spending more time in reflecting on how to best approach those different situations, difficult situations that we have, what would be your advice?
So when I was traveling around in Poland, because I was traveling in these big cities in Wrocław, they have the big Oder River going through, right? It's a really large river. So when I gave my talk, the first thing I said in my talk is I said, I recommend all of you, after this talk, get your smartphone out, drive onto the biggest bridge in the Oder River, go to the side, chuck your mobile phone into the river. That's what I said to them. Especially if you are serious about the Buddhist practice. If you're very serious about it, it's actually a good idea not to have a smartphone. And many monastics don't have a smartphone. I don't have a smartphone, and it's one of the wisest decisions I think I've made in my monastic life. So I don't have that. And so that is one way of doing it. For many people, that's not an option because you rely too much on the smartphone. So if that is not an option, I would have some very strict limits on it. So you have a smartphone. Okay, I'm only going to use it within these hours, like from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. And outside those hours, I'm going to ask my dog to swallow it or something like that. Whatever, it is somewhere you can't access it, right? Or you have some kind of safe with a timer or something on it, or you give it to your wife, or you give it to someone who's really fierce and you can't really get it back from, or whatever. That is one way of doing it, Another way is to have a smartphone with a minimum number of, you have a really boring smartphone. Apparently there are smartphones that just have black and white screens, right? You can't get colors, for example, or whatever. So there are ways, if you look into it, there are ways of making the smartphone less addictive and less of a distraction. And just look into those ways. I'm sure if you Google on it, how to make your smartphone less addictive, I'm sure you can probably find hundreds of pages just on that simple topic, I'm sure. But absolutely, I know exactly what you mean, and I think it is very bad for the whole world, actually, mental health and all kind of things. It has a really so many detrimental side effects. So thank you for a very down-to-earth and very practical question. Absolutely,
Yes, thank you very much for this morning. I have a question which is slightly political. So I was just thanking you first and foremost for this morning. And I have a question which is slightly political, but still related to Buddhism. I mean, I had the chance to deal with Tibet in the past over 4 years. With our Deputy Managing Director, Ms. Pampaloni, we even had the chance to visit Tibet last year as part of the China Human Rights Dialogue. So I looked into a bit the history of Tibet, and I looked into in particular how, say, after Tibet became part of China, after the Dalai Lama had to seek refuge outside China, how in the Western world there was a sudden spike of interest into Buddhism. Because of course the Dalai Lama, he traveled a lot in the Western world, he had a lot of public lectures, he became a sort of media personality. whether for the worse or for the better. He really became someone with whom many people associate Buddhism today in the Western world. I don't think that this is a spiritual interest. I think this is more a sort of interest into exotism, that this is something different. This is, he wears interesting clothes, sometimes he says funny things, interesting things. But I think there is a certain interest in the Western world. I think this interest is also diminishing a bit. I think it was more a generational thing for the 80s, 90s, where you had Hollywood actors, you had pop musicians associating themselves with the Dalai Lama, with the cause of Tibet. And I think this is diminishing now. But so my question is basically about your views. How do you see all this? Do you think that it was useful, that because of the very negative things that happened in Tibet in the 50s, 40s, 50s, and afterwards, actually we are now facing the situation that Tibetan Buddhism or Buddhism or the cause of Tibet is much better known in the Western world than in the past? And so this is sort of the first part of my question. And the second part is really about what the Dalai Lama said once. I think he said that, of course, it's very easy to live a purist Buddhist life in Tibet because there are mountains there, the weather is cold, there's not much to do. It's always easy to find time to meditate and to reflect about the state of the world. And I think he said something that it's very, very difficult to live as a Buddhist in the Western world because of all the distractions we have, whether in terms of the news, whether in terms of the smartphones, etc. So the second question I just wanted to ask is, how do you feel about it? Is it possible to live a sort of Buddhist life in the Western world, in the original sense of Buddhism?
Yeah. So two questions there. So which one should I do first? The last one or the first one? The last one first? The last one is the easiest one, yeah? Absolutely, it's possible, absolutely. I live in a large Buddhist monastery in Western Australia, just outside of Perth. That's about 1 hour. We kind of live in a forested area. I live in a little hut in the forest by myself. Beautiful, peaceful, only kangaroos and exotic birds around me. I kind of all I have around me, basically. And you can live full all the way Buddhist life, just like you could in the ancient time of the Buddha, or you could in Tibet, 70 years ago, or whatever. That's the first point, you can. But the second point is that Buddhism is not just about meditation practice. And this is, I think, a very important point of view that is often forgotten in the modern world. People think that if you're a Buddhist, you have to meditate. Far from it. Being a Buddhist is first and foremost is an issue of morality, of living well, or living with kindness, living with understanding and compassion. That is the foundation for everything. In fact, the foundation for everything is even deeper than that. The foundation for everything is a certain view of the world. And that view of the world is that, first of all, kindness is important. Kindness matters. Kindness gives you a greater quality of life. Once you have that view of the world, then you change your habits because of that. And then through developing your mind in that way and eventually going to meditation, this is how the whole process works. It's much more than just meditation practice. These days you hear about the mindfulness movement. The mindfulness movement is like extracting one factor of 8 on the Buddhist path, taking that out of its context and trying to make something out of it. And that's going to be very limited. That's not what Buddhism is about. It is an aspect of Buddhism. The mindfulness movement has its roots in Buddhism, but it's not a full, Buddhist path as such. So yes, it is fully possible to live as a layperson or as a monastic in the world today as a Buddhist. Absolutely. The second thing is, was it worthwhile? Was it a good thing when the kind of China invaded Tibet and then all the Tibetans fled across the world? Because it wasn't just the Dalai Lama, it was the whole diaspora of Tibetan monks everywhere around the world. Before the Chinese invasion of Tibet, Theravada Buddhism, the kind of Buddhism that we, Venerable Vimalā and myself, stand for, that was actually the main thing we found around the world. It was very strong. It went back to the late 19th century, especially with the British Empire. The British Empire were in Sri Lanka, and of course they brought back some of the scriptures from Sri Lanka and the ancient Pali language, translated that into English. Some of them became virtually Buddhists. These were like proper English barristers who decided, I'm going to check out Christianity and become a Buddhist. And that's kind of radical 19th century Victorian England to choose Buddhism over Christianity. It's like that's taking a real stand on what you believe in and powerful. But then, so that was kind of the mainstay before, and then Tibetan Buddhism kind of took over because of the large diaspora of the Tibetan people. So was it a good thing for the world? I don't think you can. You can't look at the world and this is what happens. This is just the way. Good or bad has to do with in Buddhism with intention. What are your motivations? It's about why we act in the world. These are just events. These events in the world, well, they are bad from the point of view. If the Chinese had bad intentions invading Tibet, well, it was bad for the Chinese. If the Tibetans had good intentions in coming to the rest of the world and spreading the Dhamma, then it was good for the Tibetans. If some people in the West had good intentions in practicing the path, it was good for those. So this on the individual level, it may be good or bad, depending on what your intentions and motivations are. Overall, you can't really say whether it's good or bad for the world as such. I don't think that question makes any sense. But I think it's great that we have access to Buddhist teachings in the world. These are, in my opinion, extraordinarily beautiful teachings. The more you know them, I feel that they are perfectly compatible with life in the Western world, for example. They are not very dogmatic. They are about the nature of the world. They are about kindness being a foundation for living well. You can read the word of the Buddha 2,500 years after the time of the Buddha, and it's like reading a modern book on psychology almost. I mean, it's like you read any book that is 2,500 years old and you can barely understand what's going on because there's so many references to that society and that culture. Buddhism has very, very few references to society and culture. It's all about the workings of the mind. And everything is written in that way. The Buddha says, right speech means don't lie, don't have divisive speech, don't have harsh speech, don't have idle chatter. I mean, we can all understand that, yeah? And so it goes on and on and on. It's all about kind of things we can relate to. And so I think that a modern secular society is very, very compatible with the Buddhist teachings. And that's why I think it's great fun to practice Buddhism and also to help spread it, right? To be a messenger of these teachings. So, yeah.
Thank you. And I think that should be the final message today, no? That this was just a little drop in the ocean, but a fundamental one, and the fact that it takes place here in our working environment, because initially Kanchana was saying, could we perhaps think of having this session at the AS? And the idea attracted us because it's like, yes, why not? We mix Buddhism with work because this is not the usual practice. And in fact, in our meetings, sometimes we meditate at the very beginning. I have to admit that we've left it a bit behind lately, but we always had a couple of minutes of, okay, let's be quiet and close our eyes and just center ourselves. It's a bit of mindfulness without being Buddhist, but I think it does help in attitude in life overall. And I was just thinking of this book, I'm sure you've read it, it's about, what was it called? The Monk Who Sold His Ferrari.
Oh, right, yeah.
Okay, it was a classic and it's...
Matteo Riccardo,
yes. And it's not a bad book because that also can awaken the interest for whether you want to practice or not Buddhism, but at least be aware of it. I think.
I'm glad the monk sold his Ferrari. It's not good for a monk to have a Ferrari, so it's good.
I thought it was good because it's just, as you said before, it's just let go. Materialistic wishes and so on. So, it does help a lot. But I don't know if there are many more questions or is it time to go because, unfortunately, reality knocks hard on our doors. But I would like to thank you on behalf of every one of us for this very interesting, insightful, and meditative discourse. No? You have an energy, I have to say, and it's nice to follow you because you do say a lot of things, and we just catch them and then eventually make up our own narrative. And thank you really very much, heartedly for your intervention, and thank you to Ambassador Kanchana who has taken the initiative. Thank you everyone for coming here, and we will pursue Buddhism in its own way with our own interpretation and hopefully for a more peaceful world. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.